Good evening and welcome. My name is Anna Mijic. I am from the University of Vienna's Department of Sociology, and I have the pleasure of serving as your moderator this evening at the IWM Lectures in Human Sciences, a public lecture series hosted by the Institute for Human Sciences in cooperation with the University of Vienna. This series brings leading thinkers from around the world into conversation with a broad audience, usually through 3 consecutive lectures, inviting us to reflect on vital questions of society, culture, and politics. Tonight, we have the privilege of hearing the second lecture in Professor Rogers Brubaker's series, Gender Identity, a Career, the Career of a Category. In his first lecture on Tuesday, he invited us to rethink gender identity. This evening, he'll take us further, exploring the quiet revolution of the category. For those who were not able to attend on Tuesday, allow me to offer a brief introduction, not to the topic, but to the speaker. Though, of course, Rogers Brubaker is already very well known to many of us. He is a distinguished professor of sociology at the University of California in Los Angeles. His work has had a profound impact across sociology, political sciences, and social theory, especially in the study of ethnicity, nationalism, citizenship, and gender identity. His most recently published books are Grounds for Difference, where he analyzes how categories, socially constructed differences like ethnicity, race, religion, are used as tools of inclusion and exclusion. In Trans, Gender and Race in an Age of Unsettled Identities, he examines the similarities and differences in the internal logic of gender and race, using trans as a lens to explore the fluidity of identity. And the latest one, Hyperconnectivity and its discontents, examines the social and psychological effects of pervasive digital connectivity on attention, social interaction, and perception. His books are, of course, only part of the story. Without going into his extensive list of papers, let me just mention that the most recent articles engage with questions of gender identity or gender issues that are also at the very heart of this lecture series. Whether in his books or his papers, his writing consistently challenges us to rethink familiar concepts, as we saw already in his first lecture. He invites us to question the categories we take for granted and to approach, for instance, identity or gender identity, belonging, difference in new and more reflective ways. On a personal note, if you allow, his texts have profoundly shaped my own sociological thinking since my student days. They took concepts I thought I understood, tore them apart, only to resemble them in far more illuminating ways. They have challenged me to conceptualize ethnicity without groups, to recognize the diasporic within the very concept of diaspora, and perhaps most importantly for my research, to think beyond identity, though I must admit I still use the term, but in a much more reflected way. And this is something I also pass on to my students, and so there is hardly a course I teach that does not include at least one of his texts. So it's both a pleasure and an honor to welcome Professor Rogers Brubaker back to the stage. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Anna, for these very, very kind words of introduction. In my first lecture, I outlined my analytical approach to gender identity. I explained that I would be focusing on the category itself and not on the elusive and contested phenomenon that is designated by the category. And I sketched the performative, productive, interactive, and regulative workings of the category. The performative aspect refers to the practical work that can be done with the category in various settings. The productive aspect highlights how the category brings into focus and, in a certain sense, brings into being new kinds of people. The interactive aspect refers to the looping effect, to use Ian Hacking's term, that arises as the category interacts with the people who are classified or who classify themselves using the category. And the regulative aspect pertains to the disciplinary workings of what I called the identity imperative, that is, the obligation to know oneself and to identify oneself to others through the prism of identity, and in this case, the prism of gender identity. So this evening, I want to focus more directly on the remarkable career of the category. From its obscure mid-20th century beginnings, gender identity has become a fundamental principle of social classification, one that is central to the way the social world is interpreted, organized, and administered, and one that is widely understood as a basic component of selfhood. The category has been enacted in laws, embedded in regulations, enshrined in court decisions, and embedded in organizational policies and routines. As a principle of classification, it has come to compete with, displace, or redefine classification by sex. These developments, I will argue, have amounted to a quiet revolution, a fundamental change in what you might call the conceptual infrastructure of the social world. This evening, I want to tell the story of how this happened. I'll trace the embedding of the category in 4 key domains: medicine, law, data gathering, and education. And I'll then try to explain how so fundamental a change that is today the focus of such bitter controversy, provoked so little opposition and attracted so little attention until so recently. Now, I want to add a word of clarification before I jump into my story. I'm tracing the career of the category gender identity, not the career of the category gender. As I noted in the Q&A after the first lecture, gender has become a hopelessly ambiguous term. It's often used as a synonym for sex. It's sometimes used as a synonym for gender identity, distinguished from sex, that is understood as an inner sense of self that is conceptually distinct from and empirically independent of sex. And it's sometimes also used in a much broader sense. So for second-wave feminists, gender was not the property of an individual, but rather a supra-individual aspect of social structure and culture, understood as external and constraining, not, as gender identity is generally understood, as internal and enabling. So the category whose institutional embedding I'll be tracing this evening is gender identity, not the broader and much more ambiguous category, gender. Now, scholars have traced, of course, many aspects of the institutionalization of gender, especially in connection with policies designed to promote gender equality, understood as equality between the sexes. But this is a different story. It's not entirely unrelated, of course. Gender identity is sometimes understood gender equality is sometimes understood not just as inequality between the sexes, but in a broader way that does connect with gender identity. So one sees this, for example, in discussions of language politics, where an initial concern with combating sexism in language and focusing on parity and equal visibility of the two sexes has shifted to a concern with recognizing diverse gender identities. And as I will show, gender identity is embedded in law and policy in part as a way of reinterpreting existing laws and policies that bar sex discrimination. But the story I will tell is for the most part a distinct story that does not grow directly out of the institutionalization of gender equality policies. And as I will discuss in my final lecture, the institutionalization of gender identity has come to be seen by some feminists as in tension with laws and policies designed to promote the rights of women. So let me turn now to my story of institutional embedding. beginning with the domain of medicine. It's well known that feminist scholars began to use the category gender in the social sciences in the 1970s and in history and the humanities in the 1980s. What's less well known is that feminists were not the first to use the language of gender. The category gender identity and the language of gender more generally were first used by psychologists and psychiatrists more than a decade earlier in the context of clinical assessments of disorders of sex development or intersex conditions, and a bit later in connection with transsexualism. And I speak here of transsexualism since the word transgender came into widespread use only several decades later. In the intersex context, the category gender identity was first introduced in the early 1960s to denote a socially learned rather than an innate sense of self as male or female. Now, given the cultural salience of later so-called born that way accounts of gender identity, the irony of this initially social constructionist notion of gender identity is worth noting. According to prevailing protocols at the time, infants with certain disorders of sex development were to be made to fit binary categories, and they were routinely subjected to surgeries that would normalize the appearance of their genitals. The category gender identity was introduced in this context by the hugely influential American psychologist John Money in order to make a specific and limited argument, namely that neither chromosomal sex nor prenatal hormonal exposure was decisive in determining whether such individuals would come to think of themselves as male or female. What mattered more, Money argued, was the sex of rearing through which these individuals would learn the sex category to which they belonged and everything that conventionally went along with it. Once established in the first few years of life, this gender identity, this sense of oneself as male or female, would be imprinted, this was Money's term, and would be difficult or impossible to change later on, regardless of whether or not it corresponded to chromosomal sex. So gender identity was understood by Money to be socially learned, yet once established, it was understood to be deeply rooted and indeed nearly immutable. In this context, the category, gender identity, helped clinicians formulate recommendations about surgical interventions and sex of rearing. In the transsexual context, which came a few years later, the category gender identity was used to designate what had earlier been called a psychological sex, or a sex of the mind that, in rare cases, did not match the sex of the body. As in the intersex context, the category designated a deeply rooted and, past a certain developmental point, an apparently immutable sense of self as male or female. Now, this clinical finding that a mismatched gender identity was apparently fixed and refractory to therapy helped make surgical sex reassignment thinkable as a humane way of relieving otherwise intractable suffering. It helped legitimize the gender identity clinics that were established at Johns Hopkins and several other prominent universities in the late 1960s to perform and assess the outcomes of such surgeries. The effort to legitimize the new subfield also involved a stringent screening of candidate patients so as to maximize the chances of a successful outcome, with success being defined in terms of gender conformity, ability to pass, and heterosexuality. For young children, however, the practical work done by the category gender identity in the 1960s was anything but benign by today's standards. In the intersex context, the category licensed what many now see as genital mutilation, guided by a narrow conception of acceptable genitalia, an intolerance of ambiguity, and an insistence on early binary sex assignment. And in the context of child psychotherapy, the notion of gender identity licensed efforts to correct gender nonconforming behavior, especially the behavior of markedly feminine boys, in an effort to prevent the consolidation of a non-normative gender identity that would later be refractory to change. In this initial phase, in accordance with the medicalized framing of the time, the category gender identity was established in contexts that were expressly understood as pathological. This was codified in the diagnostic category gender identity disorder, which was introduced in 1980 into the third edition of the DSM, the authoritative handbook of the American Psychiatric Association. Now, beginning in the 1990s, the transgender movement campaigned against the idea that a mismatch between gender identity and natal sex was pathological. The campaign modeled itself on the gay rights movement's successful campaign of the late 1960s and early 1970s to depathologize homosexuality. That campaign had led to the removal of homosexuality as a diagnosis from an earlier edition of the DSM in 1974. The effort to depathologize mismatched gender identity took much longer and led to a more equivocal outcome. The movement did score a symbolic success in 2013 when the diagnostic category gender identity disorder was replaced by gender dysphoria in the 5th edition of the DSM, and some years later by the category gender incongruence in the ICD, that's the International Classification of Diseases. Under this new diagnostic regime, a mismatched gender identity by itself was no longer considered a disorder. But depathologization was limited by continued medicalization in a way that was not the case with the campaign to depathologize homosexuality. When a mismatched gender identity was accompanied by so-called clinically significant distress in the language of the DSM, it continued to be construed as a disorder under the new name, gender dysphoria. And the increasingly well-established and deeply institutionalized subfield of transgender medicine held out the promise of alleviating that distress through hormonal or surgical interventions. And the continued medicalization of mismatched gender identity was not something that was just imposed from the top down by medical professionals. It was demanded from the bottom up, both by those who actively sought medical interventions in order to bring their sexed bodies into alignment with their gender identities, and by advocates who deemed such interventions medically necessary so that they could be understood as legitimate and be covered by insurance. So the result was a paradoxical combination of limited and largely symbolic depathologization and continued medicalization. The terms of medicalization, however, changed dramatically. Transgender medicine was built around and legitimated by the category gender identity, but the category came to be used in an entirely new way. It was initially a category deployed and controlled by physicians and psychiatrists in order to guide professional decisions about appropriate treatment. But as I noted in my first lecture, it became a category deployed and controlled by patients themselves, who were increasingly empowered to make their own decisions. So it was initially a category deployed by gatekeepers, used to screen and select patients for treatment, but it became a category deployed against gatekeepers and against gatekeeping. In this way, gender identity became an actionable category for lay people, a category they could invoke to make claims for medical services. This new understanding of gender identity as a patient-controlled, patient-empowering category was codified in the paradigm of gender-affirming care. And what is affirmed in gender-affirming care is patients' understanding of their own gender identity. This paradigm has been deeply institutionalized in clinical guidelines, and in the 2000s and 2010s, it was extended to children and adolescents. A Dutch clinic led the way by offering puberty blockers to gender dysphoric adolescents so as to prevent the development of secondary sex characteristics that might be experienced as distressing. The idea was that adolescents could then decide later whether to let their endogenous puberty resume or move on to gender-affirming cross-sex hormones or surgery. At a moment when the new language of gender identity was becoming increasingly salient for adolescents, the Dutch model was quickly adopted elsewhere, but also transformed. So the Dutch protocol had imposed strict eligibility criteria, gender dysphoria since early childhood that worsened at the onset of puberty, psychological stability, and minimum age requirements for medical interventions. But these criteria were relaxed or abandoned as the model was exported to the US and elsewhere. So for children and adolescents, just as for adults, gatekeeping yielded to the affirmation of asserted gender identity. Youth gender clinics multiplied, referrals soared, and medical interventions became much more common. These changes set the stage for the recent explosion of controversy about youth gender medicine, which I will take up in my final lecture. I turn now to the legal, administrative, and organizational domain. Gender identity has been inscribed in laws, regulations, and policies in connection with three aspects of the legal and administrative regulation of sex. The first concerns identification and classification by sex, the second, discrimination by sex, and the third, segregation by sex. So gender identity has come to authorize people to change their sex classification in official documents and organizational records. It has expanded the scope of bans on sex discrimination, and it has provided an entry ticket into single-sex spaces and activities. Now, developments in this domain are enormously complex, and I will have to simplify, indeed oversimplify drastically. So let me start with a few words about classification by sex. From its beginnings, the modern state has been in the business of identifying and classifying its subjects and later its citizens. And sex has always been a key axis of state classification. And states have continued to classify citizens by sex, in part out of simple inertia, even as sex has lost much of its significance as a legal classification, including, crucially, its significance in the regulation of marriage. Official sex classifications were seldom contested before the 1960s. The rare instances of contestation concerned intersex individuals, typically in cases involving marriage, divorce, or annulment. But the social recognition of transsexualism generated more frequent demands to change sex classifications, and it also generated a new kind of demand, the demand for public symbolic validation of an identity, not just for a change in legal sex for a specific purpose, such as marriage. The procedures that were established in the 1970s and 80s for making such changes were onerous and complicated. They often required surgical transition, letters from psychiatrists, and evidence of having lived in the desired gender for a certain amount of time. Beginning in the 1990s, the procedures for sex reclassification have been simplified and have given greater weight to gender identity. The shift has culminated in the model of so-called gender self-identification. This model grants full authority to the individual. It makes subjective gender identity decisive, and it allows sex reclassification through a simple administrative declaration. This model has been adopted in about 20 countries, mainly in Europe and Latin America, and most recently in the German Self-Determination Act, or Selbstbestimmungsgesetz, of last year. The second context in which gender identity has acquired legal force is that of anti-discrimination law, specifically law forbidding discrimination on the basis of sex. The trend over several decades has been to extend bans on sex discrimination to include discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And the coupling of gender identity and sexual orientation in such extensions has allowed gender identity, as it were, to piggyback on the more familiar and more widely legitimate notion of sexual orientation. Now, there have been two paths to such expansion. One path is direct, that is, provisions banning discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity could be expressly added to existing provisions banning discrimination on the basis of sex. This has been done in a number of countries in Europe and elsewhere, and in a number of US states and municipalities. The second path, which I want to highlight here, is indirect, that is, without adding any new legal provisions. Existing provisions banning discrimination on the basis of sex could be reinterpreted as also banning discrimination on the basis of gender identity. In the US, at the national level, the first path to expansion was blocked, since proposed legislation to ban discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation lacked sufficient political support. So advocates turned to courts and administrative agencies to pursue the second, indirect path. They sought a broad reading of existing bans on sex discrimination. And they scored a major success in the Supreme Court's surprising 2020 decision in Bostock. That decision protected employees from being fired on the basis of their gender identity or sexual orientation. Now, how did it do so? Well, the court argued on so-called textualist grounds that one cannot discriminate on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation without, at the same time, discriminating on the basis of sex. So the decision, in effect, redefined gender identity and sexual orientation discrimination in the workplace as a kind of sex discrimination, and that's what made it illegal. The final context in which gender identity has been institutionalized in law and organizational policy is that of sex-segregated spaces and activities. The declining significance of sex as a principle of social organization has reduced the number of such spaces and activities, but it has not eliminated them. And the growing number and diversity of those identifying as transgender has posed the question of who should have access to single-sex spaces. This has led to the specification of formal rules and policies governing access to spaces such as bathrooms or locker rooms, prison facilities, and athletic teams. A 2013 California law, for example, required schools to allow students to join sports teams and to use single-sex facilities according to their gender identity. And a far-reaching federal administrative rule adopted in 2016 toward the end of the Obama administration obliged all school districts in the country to allow students access to bathrooms and locker rooms on the basis of their gender identity. This rule marked the culmination of the phase of quiet, behind-the-scenes institutional embedding of gender identity in the federal administrative regulations in the US, but it also precipitated the end of that phase, since the nationwide reach of that regulation and the threat of powerful legal and financial sanctions provoked widespread opposition, and that's something I will address in my final lecture. So I turn now to the institutionalization of gender identity in the domain of data gathering. And here I'll be more brief, and you may wonder why I address this domain at all, but I want to make the case for why it matters. Just as states have long classified people by sex, so too they have routinely counted people by sex. In recent terms, of course, the term sex has often been replaced by gender, but that hasn't changed the principle of what they were counting, right? It's what I want to highlight here is not that terminological shift, it's a more fundamental conceptual and political shift. And this has two aspects. The first is the shift in the Anglosphere, at least, from asking a single question about sex to asking a pair of questions, one about natal sex, or even if it's called gender, and the second, a question about gender identity. The second aspect of the shift is the treatment of gender identity as more fundamental than sex in data gathering. Now, the shift to a two-part question format responded to growing demands for the statistical inclusion of gender and sexual minorities. As in the case of other demands for statistical inclusion, to be counted was to count, to publicly as a legitimate, visible component of the population. Being counted was also a presupposition for documenting and addressing inequalities of treatment and condition experienced by gender and sexual minorities. So social exclusion could be quantified only through statistical inclusion. The routine inclusion of gender identity in surveys and administrative data gathering is a powerful means of institutionalization. It universalizes gender identity by casting it as something that everybody has, rather than something only relevant to a few. It recognizes new forms of gender difference and maps out a space of legitimate gender variation by placing all gender identities side by side on the same level. Statistical inclusion confers official visibility on gender minorities and therefore also a kind of public existence as a recognized component of the population. And it establishes gender identity as a basic demographic category, and in Bourdieu's terms, a fundamental principle of vision and division of the social world. In short, the routine use of gender identity in data gathering bestows symbolic power on gender identity. But gender identity has not only been included alongside sex, it has begun to displace sex. A so-called gender by default principle has been gaining ground in the Anglophone world, and according to this principle, data should be collected in general on gender identity rather than on sex. And when data on both are collected, then reports of the data should use the data on gender identity, not the data on sex, unless there's a specific reason for using the sex data. Okay, I come now to my final domain, the domain of education. In this domain, gender identity has been embedded both in formal educational context and in informal campaigns to change the way people think about sex and gender. In the US, advocacy organizations have assembled sets of teaching resources on gender identity. One of these organizations was centrally involved in preparing a new edition of the National Sex Education Standards, published in 2020. By the end of 5th grade, according to these new standards, students should be able to, quote, distinguish between sex assigned at birth and gender identity and explain how they may or may not differ. But the lesson plans prepared by advocacy organizations introduced gender identity to much younger children. A lesson plan designed for 1st grade, for example, introduces the concept of gender identity by suggesting the following script for the teacher, and I quote, "Identity starts with an I. That's how you can remember it. I feel, I know. Gender identity is that feeling of knowing your gender. You might feel like you're a boy. You might feel like you're a girl. You might feel like you're a boy even if you have body parts that some people might tell you are girl parts. You might feel like you're a girl even if you have body parts that some people might tell you are boy parts. And you might feel like you're neither a boy or a girl, but you're a little bit of both. No matter how you feel, you're perfectly normal." Another widely used resource is the gender snow person and its variants, the gender bread person and the gender unicorn. A lesson plan for grades 3 to 8 uses the gender snow person to distinguish gender identity from sex assigned at birth, sexual orientation, and gender expression. These concepts the lesson suggests are not binaries but spectrums. Gender identity, for example, is, quote, your internal sense of being a girl, boy, both, or neither. Many lesson plans are built around children's books that illustrate these points. A popular elementary school book is I Am Jazz, written by transgender media figure Jazz Jennings and co-author Jessica Hertel. The book tells Jennings' own story in the first person. She describes herself as having, quote, a girl brain, but a boy body. This is called transgender. I was born this way. The story's narrative arc moves from unhappiness at having to wear boy clothes and at having to pretend she was a boy outside the house, which, quote, felt like telling a lie, through medical validation and parental acceptance of her transgender status, to the freedom to be herself and to be treated as a girl at school. As in the domain of statistics, but in a more personal and concrete manner, these and similar pedagogical materials serve to universalize gender identity and make it relevant to all children, not just to a few. They often do so by expressly stating, as the Gender Snow Person lesson plan does, that, quote, we all have a gender identity, and by inviting students to reflect on their own gender identity. And as in the domain of statistics, these materials map out a space of legitimate variation and place all forms of gender identity on the same level. But most education about gender identity doesn't happen in the classroom. It happens online. The identity imperative that I discussed in my first lecture encourages, it even obliges young people to reflect on their gender identity in tandem with reflection on their sexual orientation. How do they do so? They do so by turning to online platforms for information, guidance, and support. On platforms like Tumblr, people can work out their gender identities in interaction with anonymous others by locating themselves in the context of an ever-evolving taxonomy of proliferating gender and sexual identity categories. On other platforms, aspiring influencers can broadcast materials to their followers or to algorithmically assembled audiences. And an influencer in this context is, of course, an educator, an informal educator. Platforms have not only served as conduits for such informal peer-to-peer education about gender identity, they have themselves adopted and promoted the category. Already a decade ago, as I noted in my first lecture, Facebook introduced 56 custom gender options so as to, quote, help you better express your own identity on Facebook. And dating sites and other social media platforms followed suit. The developments I've sketched in these four domains amounted to a remarkably rapid establishment in core institutional domains of an entirely new principle of classification, one that was competing with, displacing, or redefining sex. Since sex is arguably the most fundamental and universal organizing category of social life in comparative and historical perspective, this is no small development. Just as remarkably, this basic change in conceptual infrastructure was not contested in a sustained way until relatively recently. Yes, of course, there were critiques, notably by radical feminists on the one hand and cultural and religious conservatives on the other. But these critiques did not gain much public traction. Gender identity was embedded in medicine, law, data gathering, and education, not only without public debate, but without much public attention of any kind. How did this happen? My explanation for the lack of public attention focuses on the US, but a similar argument could be made about Europe. In the US, the behind-the-scenes, under-the-radar institutionalization of gender identity resembles the dynamics of what the American sociologist John Scrutiny called the minority rights revolution. The term refers to the rapid administrative, legislative, and judicial shifts between 1965 and 1975 that established a wide range of non-discrimination rights, not only for African Americans, but for Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans, immigrants, women, and the disabled. Scrutiny emphasized that the shifts were not driven, for the most part, by clamorous bottom-up protests, applying pressures from the outside. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood here. Of course, Scrutiny recognized that the outside pressure exerted by the civil rights movement had been decisive in the passage of the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964. But the subsequent burst of legislative and administrative activity, and it's this substantive burst that Scrutiny calls the minority rights revolution, was a remarkably bipartisan and, for the most part, non-contentious development. Social movements were centrally involved, but not primarily as outside protesters. They worked from inside Congress, inside administrative agencies, inside the White House. In Scrutiny's summary, the minority rights revolution, and I quote, turned not on angry protests, raised fists, picket lines, and placards, but rather on people wearing suits, sitting at desks, and firing off memos. This captures well the gradual, low-profile institutional embedding of gender identity up until at least 2015, and well beyond that date in contexts that remain sheltered from public view and insulated from public pressure. The pattern holds not only in the legal and bureaucratic domain, and that's the focus of Scrutiny's account, but also in medicine, data gathering, and education. There was no mass mobilization. There were no masses to mobilize. There was little noisy public protest. LGBT organizations did mobilize, but they mobilized behind the scenes. Insider activism was more important than outsider protest. Now, why was this the case? A key part of the answer, I think, can be found in E.E. Schatzschneider's classic observation that parties to a conflict can seek either to limit or to expand the scope of conflict. Advocacy organizations were way out in front of public opinion with respect to gender identity, and they were seeking to implement measures that lacked broad public support. Limiting the scope of the conflict through behind-the-scenes mobilization and lobbying and insider activism was therefore a rational strategy. It was only more recently, as I'll discuss in my final lecture, that this strategy broke down as their opponents succeeded in expanding the scope of the conflict over the institutionalization of gender identity. Let me illustrate the behind-the-scenes nature of these developments briefly. In the legal and bureaucratic domain, the key developments occurred outside of public view, often deep in the bowels of the bureaucracy. Advocacy took the form of lobbying sympathetic administrations and key agencies at the federal and state levels for actions that could be taken either by executive order or by shifts in the regulatory interpretations of administrative agencies. Federal lobbying was directed primarily at the Obama administration, since it happened to be in office when advocacy groups were mobilizing more actively, and since it was seen as receptive to their demands. Human Rights Campaign, the largest American LGBT civil rights organization, noted with satisfaction the many small steps the Obama administration took to implement incremental changes. So in 2011, for example, the advocacy group praised the Office of Personnel Management, a very obscure agency, for, quote, adding gender identity to the categories protected under the Equal Employment Opportunity Policy for federal executive branch positions. Now, this is a good example of a small step that received absolutely no public attention. That decision was one small part of a large change that ended up redefining the civil rights era legislative ban on discrimination on the basis of sex to include discrimination on the basis of gender identity. But that change happened in piecemeal fashion, largely hidden from public view through a process of what political scientist Shep Melnick has called institutional leapfrogging, in which, and I quote, judges and administrators take a long series of small steps with each claiming to rely on the authority of the other. That is, judges citing administrative agency decisions and administrative agency decisions citing court rulings. Gender identity was quietly yet pervasively adopted in private sector anti-discrimination provisions as well. By 2023, an astonishing 90% of Fortune 500 companies expressly included gender identity in their internal non-discrimination policies, and 73% offered transition-related health coverage. Corporate adoption of these and other LGBT-inclusive policies has been measured in the Corporate Equality Index published by Human Rights Campaign since 2002. This index offers reputational benefits to firms earning high or perfect scores. In touting these benefits and in arguing that transgender inclusive policies are necessary for talent acquisition and retention, the Human Rights Campaign has pursued what has been called the politics of alignment. This is a non-contentious mode of social movement activism in which activists seek to align their goals with those of their targets and seek to make a business case for adopting their favored policies. In the medical domain, the establishment of gender-affirming care and even the extension of that paradigm to children and adolescents likewise proceeded entirely outside the glare of public attention. Affirmative care for youth was, and to a striking extent still is, presented by major professional associations, especially in the US, as the fully consensual view of the medical establishment, supported by abundant evidence and settled science. But as recent independent reviews have revealed, and here I anticipate a point I'll be discussing in my final lecture, the evidence was not, in fact, abundant, and the science was not settled. The apparent consensus was created in part through the circular process of mutual referencing, characteristic of the major clinical guidelines in the field. In the US, the apparent consensus also reflected a process of policy capture in professional associations through which practitioners committed to and invested in youth gender medicine were able to carry the day, despite the lack of strong evidence, in part by framing youth gender medicine as a civil rights issue. As I'll discuss in my final lecture, youth gender medicine became a high-profile focus of public controversy only when critics eventually challenged the quiet revolution that had already occurred. In the domain of statistics, too, gender identity was incorporated into data gathering routines with almost no public discussion, and a similar story can be told about the introduction of gender identity in the educational domain. So advocacy groups were active in these domains as well, but here too their advocacy consisted largely of behind-the-scenes lobbying rather than public claims-making. So let me take stock. The developments that I have traced prompt a series of questions. How did an initially marginal category introduced in a very specific and limited medical context become central to the structuring of social experience? How did a category that was initially relevant only in rare cases, cases that were expressly understood as pathological, come to be understood as relevant to everyone? How did the category escape the confines of the clinic and the jurisdiction of medical professionals? How did a specialized medical category become a generally binding legal and administrative category? And how did a category initially introduced alongside sex in a supplementary capacity come to be understood as more fundamental than sex? To provide a full answer to these questions would take me well beyond the scope of these lectures. What I want to do, by way of conclusion this evening, is to identify 5 intertwined processes that have contributed to the remarkable career of the category gender identity. I will call these the depathologization, universalization, vernacularization, legalization, and promotion of the category. Sketching these processes will allow me to pull together some threads from this evening's lecture as well as from my first lecture and to set the stage for my final lecture. So first, depathologization. I discussed earlier this evening efforts in the field of gender medicine to depathologize gender identity by recasting gender identity disorder as gender dysphoria. But depathologization has a broader social, cultural, and political meaning. It refers not simply to the renaming of a diagnostic category, but to a more fundamental reconceptualization of the relation between gender identity and sex. A mismatch between gender identity and sex was no longer to be understood as a pathological condition under the jurisdiction of the medical and psychiatric professions, or even as a problem to be addressed. It was rather to be understood as a phenomenon of normal and legitimate variation. Mismatch, in short, was to be understood not as disorder, but as difference. The second process I want to highlight is universalization. Originally understood as relevant only in rare cases, gender identity came to be understood as relevant to everyone. Depathologization was a precondition for this, but it was not sufficient. In the medical domain, the category was relevant only to those who experienced their gender identity as a source of suffering or as a problem requiring professional help. But establishing gender identity in law and administration, in data gathering, and in education made the category relevant for everyone. Banning discrimination on the basis of gender identity, or making access to sex-segregated spaces depend on gender identity, presupposes the universal applicability of that category, right? Asking people in a survey to report their gender identity in addition to their sex presupposes that everyone has such a gender identity and knows what it is. And teaching children the difference between gender identity as something one feels on the inside and sex assigned at birth as something on the outside likewise presupposes that everyone has such an inwardly felt gender identity. The third process I want to note is vernacularization. I mean by this the process through which the category gender identity escaped the control of professionals and became widely available for popular use and for social movements. Vernacularization was the precondition for what I characterized in my first lecture, drawing on Ian Hacking, as the looping process through which a category initially deployed in professional context was appropriated by lay people, redefined in lay contexts, and subsequently imported back into professional practices and discourses. So top-down categorization under the control of professionals yielded to an ongoing, open-ended interplay between professional and lay uses of the category. The fourth process is the legalization, or more broadly, the formalization of gender identity. In each of the institutional domains I've discussed, gender identity has been embedded in formal organizational routines and procedures and subjected to formal rules and policies. Legalization goes a step further, giving such rules binding force and broader scope. Through formalization and legalization, gender identity loses the fluidity, the flexibility, the negotiability it has in informal context. It is reified. It's turned into an explicitly defined, clearly bounded, organizationally tractable, and legally recognizable thing. The final process I want to note is the promotion of gender identity to a position of primacy vis-a-vis sex. In each of my four institutional domains, gender identity has been construed as deep and foundational, as the locus of the true, authentic inner self, while sex, demoted to sex assigned at birth, is seen as more superficial and contingent. So in medicine, the paradigm of gender-affirming care takes gender identity as fundamental, essential, and given, while considering the sexed body as accidental, contingent, and alterable. The task, then, of gender-affirming care is to remold the sexed body to conform to the gender identity, the authentic inner self. In law, especially in so-called gender self-identification laws, gender identity has been construed as determining what counts as legal sex, so as more fundamental. In data gathering, the gender by default principle that I mentioned holds that data should be collected and reported on gender identity, not sex, unless there's a specific reason for needing data on sex in a particular context. And in education, gender identity is presented as the essence of who one really is on the inside, while sex is treated as a contingent and possibly mistaken assignment based on superficial external factors. Taken together, the changes I have traced in medicine, law, data gathering, and education amounted to a quiet revolution, a fundamental change in the basic conceptual infrastructure of the social world. It's therefore no wonder that when public attention caught up with these developments, they became the object of intense controversy. And it's the story of this controversy that I will turn to in my final lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Brubaker, for this highly insightful lecture. You have compellingly demonstrated how the category of gender identity has evolved from its medical origins into a central principle of social classification. What impressed me actually most is how your presentation fosters a fresh perspective simply through its clear and thorough exposition of the category's development and institutionalization. Before inviting the audience, I've been granted the privilege of opening the discussion. A modest perk of the moderator's role, one I happily accept, but I will keep it short, I promise. You describe this process that has driven profound changes in institutions such as medicine, law, education, and statistics or data collection as a quiet revolution that largely unfolded behind the scenes and only in recent years have become the focus of public debates. Without wanting to preempt your next lecture, I would like to raise a question that stems from a sociology of knowledge perspective. In the social construction of reality, Peter L. Berger and Thomas Luckmann argue that institutions are stabilized as objective realities not only through legal or administrative measures, but also through everyday, deeply internalized legitimations, mostly habitual or taken for granted pre-theoretical legitimations or rudimentary theoretical propositions. According to the authors, when such legitimations are actually absent, a mismatch can arise between the subjective reality of individuals, the reality how it is perceived by human consciousness, and the objectified reality of institutions. People may notice that something is different, but they lack a culturally or morally practiced framework to understand or justify these changes. Could it be argued then that the quiet nature of this revolution, the fact that it largely took place behind the scenes, has resulted in a lack of everyday internalized legitimations, and that this very lack, although not producing resistance directly, provide a kind of a fertile ground for politically mobilizing individuals against those who enacted actually these changes behind their backs. Changes that, among other things, now supposedly make it impossible to avoid reflection of one's own gender identity or that of one's children. Put bluntly, has this quiet revolution left people highly prone to political mobilization by creating actually a void in everyday internalized legitimations? That would be the first question, and if I may, I would like to follow this with a second one, a much shorter one. Could you maybe point out the most central structural factors that have facilitated this institutional embedding of gender identity in the contexts you have focused on? As far as I understood, this is particularly the United States, and but you're also referring to Europe and Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. These are, really fantastically rich questions. And I really particularly appreciate the first question, because I really hadn't thought about the relevance of Berger and Luckman to my project. But I think that relevance is quite profound, and I think you put it actually quite nicely. So the short answer is simply yes, but I won't. I will go a little bit. I'll go a little bit beyond that short answer. I do think the lack of everyday institutionalized legitimation and what you call the mismatch between the subjective reality and the objectified reality indeed helps explain the fact that people are easily targeted by political mobilization once this starts to happen. And this is indeed something I'll be talking about in my next lecture. But I think one way to kind of get into your question is to note that there are really two meanings to institutions and institutionalization. And the Berger and Luckman meaning is one, right? The sociology of knowledge meaning of what an institution is, this deeply taken for granted understandings in everyday life. But then, most of sociology works with a somewhat different notion of institutions and institutionalization. And we talk of institutions as like these institutionalized sectors that I discussed in my talk about medicine as an institution and law as an institution and education as an institution and so on. Now, I think there is a connection between that kind of general sociological concept of institutions and the Berger and Luckman concept. And I think one way of getting at that is through my favorite definition of institution. It comes from a sociologist, Richard Jenkins, who defined institutions as patterns of activity that are established as the way things are done. I love that because it's so simple, and I can teach with it. So I use this in, really almost anything you read. Berger and Luckman is completely impossible to teach to undergraduates. But this definition by Richard Jenkins, I think, makes a lot of sense. Patterns of activity that become established as the way things are done. So this connects that general sociological notion of institutions like education, law, et cetera, with the Berger and Luckman, because even in organizations, right, patterns of activity get established as the way things are done. Things become taken for granted inside of organizational routines. Right? But there's a difference that I think gets at the issue here, and the difference that's relevant to my story is that when things become institutionalized in particular sectors like law or medicine, then certain things become taken for granted, but only in those settings, right? Only in a certain milieu, only for certain people. And they do become deeply institutionalized in the Berger and Luckman sense for the people working with those institutional routines, but they don't get legitimized and deeply taken for granted outside of those circles. So, so precisely then you have this situation that you described as a mismatch between the subjective reality and the objectified reality. And maybe that doesn't matter for a while, right? But when what comes to be, so you have the situation though that where what's taken for granted in these restricted contexts, in the context of youth gender medicine, in the context of anti-discrimination law, in the context of progressive elementary education and so on. What's taken for granted in those contexts is out of sync with what's taken for granted in the wider everyday world. And then when stuff from those institutionalized contexts spills out into the broader life world, as it does, this is part of my argument in the third lecture, that these specialized institutional spaces, which no one paid attention to for a long time, they do start to spill over. And then you get that mismatch, and then you indeed get the potential for conflict and for mobilization. And I thank you for introducing the Berger and Luckman and making me realize its relevance here. Just on structural factors, let me mention two. One is the decentralization and fragmentation of the American medical system. There's no overarching authority to set guidelines for clinical practice in different fields. This gives a lot of leeway to professional associations like the American Academy of Pediatrics to formulate their own guidelines. So what is American Academy of Pediatrics is a huge Association has 67,000 members. I just looked this up the other day. 67,000 members. How does a 67,000 member organization formulate its guidelines for the various branches of medicine that concern young people? You defer to the people who have expertise and experience in a particular branch. There's no other way to do it, really. So in the case of a newly emerging area of practice like youth gender medicine, without a long record of clinical practice to review, this has made professional associations vulnerable to capture by relatively small groups of practitioners who have a strong moral and political commitment, but also a strong professional and sometimes even a financial interest in establishing and defending the legitimacy of their particular sector of practice. Now, I don't want to overemphasize that point. Obviously, youth gender medicine was established in Europe as well. It originated there, as I mentioned, in the Netherlands, then was exported to the US and elsewhere. But where the differing structures of medicine really matter is in the phase of contestation, and something I'll talk about in my next lecture. But the key point, very briefly, is that once questions start emerging about the practice of youth gender medicine towards the end of the last decade, then the centralized medical systems in the Nordic countries, in the UK, can very quickly decide to commission new reviews of the evidence, commission systematic reviews, and once they get those reviews, they can just revise their guidelines, right? It's not a matter of politics, it's not a matter of legislation, it's just done in a fairly straightforward way. Whereas in the US, we ended up now, once things get politicized, we end up in this incredible mess where medical policy is being made by state legislatures and the Trump administration. And that I don't think anyone would argue that this is a very good way to make medical policy. So the structure of the medical systems, centralized systems, single-payer systems, where it's possible to make decisions and act on them in a nonpartisan way, versus this decentralized structural system in the US makes a big difference. And the second point I'll mention is just a kind of generalization of that point about decentralization, which is characteristic not only of the medical system in the US, but of the American polity more generally. So it's striking that in contrast to many European countries, in the US, there's been no national legislation in this whole process, right? There was one very minor thing, which was about a piece of hate legislation about hate crimes, which added the category gender identity to, but otherwise nothing, right? Which is a sharp contrast to Europe. Why does it matter that you don't have national legislation? Well, national legislation is a kind of focalizing point. It's where you have discussions and debate and public controversy, and maybe you start to legitimize things in the life world. But this doesn't happen in the US, so instead, in this fragmented and decentralized landscape, the institutionalization proceeds in less visible sites, in state legislatures, in municipal councils, in bureaucratic agencies, in corporate boardrooms, in school district boards, in courts, in professional associations, and so on. So that's the fragmentation I would highlight as a key structural factor.
Thank you.